Hey, what's up, Comics World? This is Splendopia. I'm Rob Casey. Today, I want to talk to you about Move the Needle. Move the Needle is a hashtag started by this guy, if you are on YouTube and follow comic books, called Diversity in Comics. Probably a lot of you have heard of him if you're on my site. Diversity in Comics is a guy who started doing videos about a year and a half ago, where he was diagnosing some things that he saw that were wrong with the contemporary comic book industry. And I started listening to him because, as you've seen in my other videos, I'm a big G.I. Joe fan. And the writer of G.I. Joe at the time was going out of his way on social media to troll and antagonize the fans. In my opinion, I've been a steady comic book buyer and reader since I was a kid. I guess I dipped out in high school and in college, and for about 5 years after, I think I started buying comic books again in earnest in about 2005. So for the past 13 years or so, and I really got back into G.I. Joe. I bought a lot of issues off the rack, but mostly I bought trades. I just collected trades, which a lot of people do. I think it doesn't necessarily help your local comic book store. It does keep the medium alive, but maybe not the best way to go about it. So when Aubrey Sitterson started his campaign against the loyal readers of G.I. Joe, in my opinion, I hadn't read his stuff yet. I was basically reading reviews of my fellow G.I. Joe fans, and I was watching them. He didn't engage with me because I haven't been on Facebook for a long time. About the same. I think I quit Facebook. I can't remember exactly when I quit it, but it was right when it went public. A good tip, by the way, guys. If you don't know what the product is you. That's the old axiom for Facebook that got me out of it way back in the day. But a lot of this stuff was going on Facebook, and I heard people complaining about it. I would see screenshots. Basically, like Aubrey, it seems pretty clear that he had a progressive socialist agenda, and a lot of that was starting to leak itself out into the work, which is I'm not in principle opposed to. The problem is it's a little bit incongruous for the G.I. Joe brand. And I think the G.I. Joe brand there is this complicated thing going on where it is this U.S. military brand, but it's also ostensibly marketed to children, and some people have a big problem with it. It's been a problem ever since I was a kid growing up in it. My mom didn't want to buy me action figures who were terrorist action figures, and I understood where that came from. I thought she was totally wrong, though. I looked at it as a child of the 80s and 90s as just another extension, another sort of anti-free speech extension of a puritanical influence over pop culture. The idea that you could expunge ideas about war and violence and sexuality from popular entertainment has always been totally absurd to me, in part because those are some of the things that compel people to popular entertainment. So there's sort of a selling point that you're getting rid of, but also those are the realities of our world. Those are the realities of the way that the human species has evolved and the structures that we put in place to connect and govern ourselves. And you can't just wish it away with censorship or a decision that the material is problematic. So back to Diversity in Comics. He started diagnosing a lot of this stuff, and about the time everything came to a head on 9/11 when Aubrey Sitterson, you can look up what he said. He basically was like, if you weren't in Lower Manhattan on 9/11, all your memorials ring hollow, is kind of the nice way of saying what he said. And then when people confronted him on it, he gave him a big hearty F you, literally. And one of the things that affected me very deeply about that as a G.I. Joe fan is just the misunderstanding of all the servicemen, all the men and women and kids. I mean, really kids. I was in New York City on 9/11. There were a lot of kids that went into the service years and years and years after 9/11. But in a lot of ways, they were just as affected by it through their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan as people who lived through Lower Manhattan that day. And that's always been my position. I think it's fair, and I think it's accurate. And it bothered me. It bothered me greatly that like Aubrey didn't see that. He didn't understand his stewardship at that role. It bothered me the way Chris Ryall tried to defend his job, and put him on another book, changed the title of G.I. Joe to Scarlet Strike Force. But the G.I. Joe fans, they held firm. They basically said, we're not supporting this guy anymore. This was not a campaign to get the guy unemployed and unemployable forever, but it was definitely a campaign to get him off the book. Because by that point we had had enough. The other thing, when I say he's trolling people on social media, when he would put some of these ideas into his book and people would complain about them, he would go to these like knee-jerk insults that we've all become tired of, alt-right or Nazi. Basically, like anybody who is not, on the liberal side of the aisle is some sort of, like a crypto-fascist reactionary. Crypto-fascist is actually something that Diversity in Comics was called by another comics, I guess writer. I was going to say artist. But back to Move the Needle. So that's how I got started watching DNC's videos. And then after a few months, he pitched this thing called Move the Needle, where he was saying, because of these like bad books, a lot of these comic book stores are going out of business. They're dying. They're suffering. We need to get that out there and buy books. He's going to recommend books that he liked. People were going to share knowledge about the books that they read, that they liked. We were going to go out and buy books. We were going to try to help and save the industry. And I bought into that really, really hard. And I spent the majority of the first part of this year buying a lot of comic books. And through that, I started thinking about this old idea of Cyborg USA and how I could bring my own creative project to life after all these years. I went from buying trades of G.I. Joe, to trying to buy all the new issues every week, and also investing in a lot of these old titles. You see, this is basically like my last couple of batches of books I bought. You can see there's a lot of those foil DC books, the True Believer, What If books, a little bit less of the Marvel, and then even some independent. I bought a lot of Blake Northcott because she's been great on Twitter, and I've always been a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan. So to go back a few steps, I supported Move the Needle. I posted my Move the Needle hauls for months, and all I got for it was abuse from comic book pro. Basically, there's a cabal of comic book pros. Many of them I was instantly blocked. I had no interaction with them. I was instantly blocked by them as soon as I started like posting Move the Needle hashtag. If I would post something on Comicsgate, I would find myself swarmed on all sides by these guys, blocked by many of them. And I tried to be honorable. I tried to not instigate any conflict, but address the things that they were saying. Many of them were hurtful and disingenuous, I found. And especially the comments about Diversity in Comics, who, when you watch his videos, I think it's totally unreasonable to smear him as a bigot or the leader of a hate group. I mean, all those things are just patently untrue. He's a guy with some conservative tastes about his art, and not even like. Well, when I say conservative, a lot of them are like classical ideas about his art, and about the state of comic books, and the kinds of things that we've always all loved in comic books. He's looking at preserving or at highlighting when it's done right, and pointing out when it's not done as well. So, sometime in the midsummer, I decided I was just going to stop I was going to stop posting on Move the Needle. I thought it had lost its point. Diversity in Comics is still pushing it. People are still using it. To me, the point of it was to buy books, support creators, and support stores. And what I found from the creators and the stores and the people that were vehemently opposed to diversity in comics is that they didn't want that support. They wanted to attack people that were buying books. So I said, okay, all right, I'm going to stop doing this. But I kept buying stuff. I kept buying things that I was interested in, on a weekly basis from my local comic book store, which doesn't really need as much help as many other ones because it's located in Manhattan and is probably one of the biggest comic book stores in the world. It's Midtown Comics. But I kept buying all these books until just a couple of weeks ago, and that's when I decided that I was done buying books from comic book stores because if you are aware, Mark Waid, again, like months and months ago, committed what I believe is tortious interference against diversity in comics. He was trying to crowdfund a book called Jawbreakers, and Mark Waid, according to his social media posts and the timeline of events that I witnessed firsthand because I was following this stuff as it was happening. I was interested in DNC and his release of Jawbreakers at the time. What I decided was that I was going to stop buying books when Mark Waid's fundraiser came out, his GoFundMe to support his defense against the lawsuit that DNC Richard Meyer ultimately filed against him. And the lawsuit, I think, is totally appropriate. But you see in Mark Waid's GoFundMe site, and in artists like Scott Snyder, who I've supported heavily over the past year and a half, and artists like Larry Hama, who I've supported heavily throughout his entire career, these guys coming out and double smearing, double disparaging diversity in comics as a hate group, as a bigot, as quote unquote alt-right. Which again, he's none of those things. If you listen to his videos, he's none of those things. It's a smear campaign. What actually happened, what the lawsuit is actually about, is a gatekeeper, a guy who couldn't stand a wrong think, a wrong opinion, a guy who considered himself to be the sheriff of comics, Mark Waid, getting involved between an independent comic creator and a distributor, a producer of that work, a publisher who had agreed to put his book into comic book stores. Mark Waid got in the middle of it, blocked the contract, stopped it, and consequently destroyed Diversity in Comics' dream of getting his book Jawbreakers into stores, a book that he worked on with other artists who were popular on YouTube, like John Malin and Ethan Van Sciver, who did a cover for it. And I decided for me that was a bridge too far. I can't support an industry full of comic book pros who are so invested in gatekeeping, who are so invested in blocking new voices, in blocking new works. That's the same sort of to me it's like puritanical censorship. As much as Tipper Gore and hardcore rap music or hardcore rock music in the 80s and 90s. It's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of gatekeeping. It's the same sort of blockage of artistic expression and freedom that needs to be recognized and stood up to and stopped. So, if artists want to donate to Mark Waid to support things like tortious interference, I don't want to support them. And this big stack of comics right now, that represents my last big purchase of comics in the comic book world until Mark settles with Richard C. Meyer. So I encourage you, all friends of Mark Waid, all friends in the comic book business, talk to Mark, tell him he's in the wrong, and it's time to settle, and you'll get me back as a customer.